Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Morality of Everyday Things. Sorry, it's been a little while. We've had a bit of a hectic month over at our day jobs.
Relevantly, it was Earth Day recently. I say relevantly because this whole episode is going to be about climate change. Well, it's going to pertain to climate change.
Jacob, what is this week's question?
Is it wrong to have children in an era of climate change?
Interesting one. God, I wish I'd read the notes. Well, for anyone who doesn't know, we do run a carbon offsetting and tree planting website. Platform called TreePoints.green. That's obviously kept us really busy in the build-up to Earth Day. We had a bunch of great launches. I'm actually, for those watching the video, I'm wearing one of our partners' clothing brands, Altered Clothing.
Shout out.
Solid shout out. And put a bunch of integrations live. It's just been a crazy busy month. And then also, the other thing we do, Stasher, has been picking up. If you are a regular listener, let us know. Your love will make us post more regularly, like a dog that just needs to be petted to know that you care.
We crave that validation. That's what it's all about.
And please leave reviews. For anyone who's new, the Morality of Everyday Things is a podcast where we discuss everyday morality. Jake and I, longtime friends, studied together at Oxford University. Technically, only I studied philosophy, but Jake's okay.
Did a module in ethics once.
And even then, I did I mostly focused on the politics and economics, but whatever. We can let that slide. Jake, set us up for today's question.
All right. So, question was, is it wrong to have children in an era of climate change? And what we like to do normally is break down definitions. I thought before we get into that, it's a provocative question. And do you have any thoughts just up front? I'm happy to share my views. But before digging into this and take this as if I just asked you fresh.
Yeah, it was just you're not allowed to say anything. It's yes or no.
Yeah.
I feel like my answer is no.
Okay. Why?
As in no, it is not wrong.
Surface, why? What's high level?
I feel like as soon as you say this, my first thought is antinatalist arguments, which I just kind of don't vibe with. As with many things, the real answer is a bit more nuanced. I think it's a legitimate consideration. And to be fair, even the antinatalist argument we'll discuss, there are times when it's not irrelevant. But I mean, my overall thing is should you be agonizing over having one or two children, which for a lot of people is probably one of the most fulfilling things they can do with their life.
It's a major, major life decision.
Yeah. Well, it's also, literally evolutionary, in an evolutionary perspective, the thing that we are programmed to want to do. I don't think that you necessarily have to give up one of the most important things in your life. I think the truth is that tackling climate change in an effective way is a large process that involves making sure that we can do that without making life unlivable. I mean, you could make the argument that, hey, we should kill everyone and that will solve climate change. But that's obviously the point of the problem is that we want to find acceptable ways of dealing with it, not ridiculously extreme ways that are perhaps even worse than the, although then again, it is, should it be a consideration? Not should it, should there be a rule that you will be banned from having children?
And what you just said is, I think, that's the first thing I thought of when I was looking into this question is I feel like it unravels logically. If the reason not to have
struggled
kids,
with that, then
what's that?
You probably struggled with that.
If the reason not to have kids, mate, come on, not in front of all my friends. If the reason not to have kids is to prevent climate change from getting worse because climate change is going to kill us all, then not having kids
can't kill us if we don't exist.
It has a flavor of that.
Yeah,
I feel like it doesn't stand up to Kant's point as well. You couldn't make it a universal rule. You wouldn't wish for it to be a max, unless you're a hardcore antinatalist. And
you could have a thing you shouldn't have children unless the earth can sustain them. That's a universal. That's the thing you can make a max in. And also, who cares if Kant doesn't like it? That doesn't mean it's not right. I've listened to a bunch of philosophy podcasts recently, and they're all these PhDs. I think the funniest thing is when you turn morality from a practical thing that people discuss to this thing that supposedly someone can be an expert in, as if there's some sort of deep level of objectivity that they have simply studied more.
I don't know. It's like professional ethicists. What do they do?
When it's when the government's have called in these professional bioethicists. It's okay. Bioethicists will solve the the CRISPR debates. It's really? How's that going to help? Oh, thank God. Somebody's talked about it a lot.
Arlene, and part of the reason we like to do this is because I think morality is at its most interesting when it's questions that pertain to our everyday lives. And obviously this is a big one. Having the decision to have kids is a major decision that people may choose.
It sounds very fairy, but I've had a couple mates genuinely, one guy I think was talking nonsense, but I know him. I was like, yeah, sure, mate. So I've had mates genuinely talk about on the extreme side, oh, maybe I shouldn't have kids, to, oh, maybe I'll adopt. And then the kind of the one that's most, I think most feasible will come to this is like, I think I might have fewer kids. And, I'm also thinking like, you're saying because it's because of climate change, but I know it's because millennials actually don't have money.
I'm the same. I know of people who are, at that stage in life and talking about climate change. Like
because Jake's old.
Including climate change in that debate.
How old are you?
27.
37.
What? Okay.
That was the sound of Jake Balding.
Let's crack right on into what we normally do at the beginning, which is break down the question into definitions. Not a hell of a lot to define here. I think it's actually fairly straightforward. Everyone knows what kids are. And climate change, I think, again, we won't get too much into what it is. I take it fairly for granted that people are familiar with it. We can go into some of the effects and why it's relevant to this question.
Yeah, we'll take it that it's, man-made climate change, and that, that it will have catastrophic effects within, unfettered, it will have catastrophic effects within actually a reasonable horizon. Catastrophic, to be fair, I think one thing that's not very clear that people talk about is this whole 2-degree thing. It's not that if we hit 2 degrees, everyone dies, right? It's not like
immediately.
It's not like a doomsday event, right? If we hit the 2, it's not going to be like just at the peak of like a then drop. Like more likely, it's going to be continuing, and certain factors like extreme weather, desertification, like the flooding of coastal cities will get worse and worse. One thing I do debate is this kind of equating climate change with the death of the entirety of humanity, or even the death of the planet. Like I think, as what's his name? Attenborough correctly put, like actually the planet will be just fine.
I mean, the planet's lived through ice ages. It's lived through like all sorts of ridiculous.
Hardier than some stupid people who've only been around for tens of thousands of years. It's been around for billions.
Yeah, there's that theory.
Part in space.
There's that theory, and I can't remember if it's called Gaia theory or something like that, but he basically posits that the Earth is a living organism and humans are kind of like microbes on its surface, and effectively, it's that sort of metaphor that humanity has made the Earth sick, and then the Earth will sort of eventually expel us.
Is that just metaphorical in semantics, or I mean, how many shrooms were you on? The world, man, is just all connected.
We are literally all one. I don't know how much that's just metaphorical. I think there are people who literally believe the Earth is alive. Anyway, by the by, let's jump into the next phase. Why? Let's give this question some structure. What's it asking? Why would it be wrong to have kids? I think there are 2 reasons. Then this is how we'll break down the answer. The first reason why it'd be wrong to have kids in the era of climate change is because it would be cruel to bring children into what we've essentially defined as a doomed world.
So that's something that we'll dig into deeper, because outside of climate change, that has a rich philosophical history. So the main thing is that you would be doing a disservice to the child in that context, right?
It would be doing them harm.
Yeah, and I guess you could find analogies of like, in the widest sense, having a child when you're not prepared to handle a child. I suppose it's part of the reason why people don't want irresponsible young people having children or take issue with that, despite the fact that they may acknowledge their right to do that, or people who, say, for example, are drug addicts or in some position where their ability to raise a child effectively is compromised.
Sure.
Okay, so that's, again, this is tying it specifically to the climate change question, though. So you would be dooming these children to a world that would be difficult because of climate change.
Because it would be a bit hot.
Yeah. Again, I actually think that that's relatively weak because, like I said, it's taking a little bit too much, like the climate change is super significant. But again, it's taking it more like a 2 degrees and suddenly it like 90% of people die and the other 10% live in like a Mad Max style wasteland. You refer to a Mad Max style wasteland really often, I've noticed.
Yeah, it's like a great analogy or like metaphor or whatever. But you're right. That's the essence of the first argument. It would be cruel to children. The second argument is sort of, I don't know, it's consequentialist. It sort of flips the issue on its head. It's saying the reason it would be wrong to have children is because having children contributes to the issue of climate change itself. So actually you'd be exacerbating the problem.
Yeah. So if you think about your footprint, you could think of your footprint as what you are responsible for and what your dependents are for. So for example, a lot of people will say that they take responsibility for their pet, right? And again, like the other one, it's not one that we considered in the pet argument, but that could be an argument against pets. Like it's unnecessarily increasing your footprint by 30-ish% or whatever it is that pets are. So the argument is basically more people means more consumption means more emissions, and more emissions means climate change gets worse faster.
Exactly that. And I suppose you can think about it in terms of harm, as the first argument is you're bringing harm to your future children. The second argument is you're causing harm to society.
Yeah, you're causing public harm. Very distinct, though, because the first one is basically antinatalism.
Yes.
And the second one is more of a, what was the term? Problem of the tragedy of the commons?
Yeah, it kind of is a tragedy of the commons.
Everyone probably wants to have children, but, there's not enough resource for everyone to have as many children as they want necessarily. I mean, we can argue whether that's actually correct or not. We'll refer to Malthus, I'm sure, for anyone who doesn't know. Dope little economist from
the 1800s, I think.
Something like that, yeah. I mean, he was wrong as hell. But I mean, but you know what? Like, credit to him, it was still a cool theory that has some learnings. And it's bad induction to say that because he was wrong once. I heard someone else say this in a similar podcast. I don't want to copy other people's things. Forget about them. But yeah, just because he was wrong at that time doesn't mean it never pertains to the truth.
There's some underlying sort of wisdom in the principle, right? And I think the fact that the fact his ideas live on so long after his time.
Yeah, no. I mean, it has a fair point, and we'll come to this.
So you've got the structure. We'll look at those two arguments one after the other. Let's go into the first one, the cruelty to children argument. And I think probably a fair place to start is, why do people have children, and is there a moral basis for it? Is it a right that people have? Now, technically it is. Technically, it's recognized as a human right. It's actually Article 12, the right to marry and start a family.
What the UN says is a human right and what are objective human rights are not necessarily synonymous. Okay,
this is true. We shouldn't take this as the basis of morality, but it's an interesting
reference. So it is. But no, I acknowledge your point. They say it is. I mean, there are some obvious caveats to that. I mean, the right to procreate and have it says to marry and start a family.
To marry and start a family.
That's open to a lot of interpretation. But I mean, my immediate impression is, what if people who have the physical impediment that stops them having their own children, why do we make it so much harder for them to start a family than we do, say, I mean, again, I'm using extremes. I'm not characterizing this as typical, but you can have two 16-year-olds who are addicted to heroin. And they can have babies, as many as they want. They have the right to do that. And yet, when we think about a gay couple, homosexual couples, it's so much harder. So, okay, whatever. They say Article 12, the right for people to marry and start a family. I don't think that that's actually reflected. I think a lot of it is down to circumstance of what people can actually do. You also touched on why. Why do you think people how can you answer that beyond an innate drive?
Well, it's interesting because it is obviously an innate drive. The drive to procreate is kind of programmed, to use the word you used. It's programmed into our genes. I mean, Dawkins's selfish gene was basically positing that we are just biological code, and
we're just trying to propagate our code.
Yeah, and as long as we fulfill that by having babies, we're on track, and the genes are.
Do we have anything deeper to say there? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I think so, because I think actually one of the features of human evolution is that we're less subject to our basic urges. We develop capacity for reason, we develop capacity for morality, and it's telling that as societies become more developed, quote unquote, birth rates and population growth decline. And there's a few factors there, I think. I think one thing is it's a result of medical advances. There's less risk of infant mortality, and that's just a practical thing. You need to have fewer kids. Changes in cost of living are possibly a factor too. But I also think part of the reason people have kids and the reason people adopt is because it's not really just about passing on your genes. It's about having a family and joy of having a family and raising a child.
My question to you is, you said birth rates drop, right?
Yeah.
But remember, birth rates is average number of children for average number of adults, right? And it's definitely true that birth rates drop, as in families have fewer kids. And that's because of infant mortality, as you said, many will say, and also more control. But to the
contraception,
control to contraception. I wonder to what extent might it be the case that maybe more developed countries see the rate of people starting families higher, but the average number of children per family significantly lower. To be fair, though, then I think about the kind of the career-driven, I don't know, Western world, and how starting families kind of falls to the wayside. I don't know. My point there is that I wouldn't just take more educated people don't want children because of the infancy. What's the term? Sorry,
infant birth rates. I don't know.
Because of fertility rate. Just because fertility rates drop, it's also because people have less kids. That doesn't measure. That doesn't measure the desire of the family.
Yeah, exactly. It's you're not looking at like the sort of binary variable of family, yes or no. You're looking at number of children per kids, family. And that it's like a weighted average, I guess. So if you've got a family with like 10 kids, that's bringing up the average more.
If you know that 40% of your children will die, and it's very important you have one or two children particularly take care of you, maybe more, then
it possibly, I was thinking about this too. It possibly reflects a changing attitude towards children as well. So in the West, we
find them annoying.
We respect them as autonomous beings as opposed to just resources.
Like, I appreciate that you're a human being, and that's why I don't spank your bottom.
I don't know if this is just an unfair characterization of like Victorian kids from like Dickens, or I don't know, just like history.
As everyone knows, an accurate portal into the past.
Yeah, but you know, in Victorian society, it felt like kids were basically just like labor resources, you know. Whereas now, I mean, you look at kids as like,
now they're work. They used to work, now they are work.
It's kind of like pets. Animals were animals used to labor, and now we lavish them with sort of care, attention, and
because life is meaningless, and we find some meaning in that. Fur babies.
But okay, we've talked about why people have kids.
Actually, one thing though, sorry, you said the right to marry and start a family. Family. Right? Family doesn't necessarily mean having children, does it? Some people might consider their partner and their pet family.
I think that's fair. And certainly, it definitely includes adoption and like other. Yeah, it doesn't mean having your own children.
Nope. Okay, carry on.
Okay, so I think that leads us quite neatly onto the question of what is antinatalism and why is it a movement? We've established some fairly clear reasons why people like to have kids, why it's a thing.
Yes. So anti-navalism is when you're against the use of boats in military.
Terrible.
Just kidding. That's navalism. Antinatalism, you go on, mate. You go.
Okay. Antinatalism is... Well, I think it's easily misunderstood. Strictly, it's the philosophy that additional births have a negative impact on society. And I guess the sort of argument underpinning that is that life is full of suffering and strife and misery. The moments of happiness and pleasure are few and transitory and elusive. And ultimately, it all ends in death. I think I've sort of paraphrased this guy called David Benatar, who's one of the main philosophers behind.
Jacob, can I call you up there? You said that it was bad for society.
Yeah.
Is that like some sort of specific definition that you found, or because I feel like the takeaway should be that it's bad for the child, right?
Good question.
But then you specified that life is difficult, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds like you're referring specifically to the child. So it sounds like the argument there is it's unfair on the child to birth them.
So yeah, the Benatar quote definitely makes that point clear. The philosophy as defined, antinatalists are adherents of the belief that human beings are a destructive force to the earth, and therefore it's morally wrong to create more of them. Which I guess you're right. It's kind of, that's two different things. They're distinct.
That's weird that it says specifically to the earth. Like, what if we can set up life-sustaining colonies in space on other planets, et cetera, et cetera?
They're not on Earth.
Yeah. Or, I mean, the obvious point to the antinatalism argument that you mentioned, like logical extreme of there being no people. You know, obviously, what if you run it to the point where population reaches a sustainable level, ignoring the fact that you know, it would create a huge economic issue if we suddenly had like a generation that was smaller than you. Because it would be like big, small, big, and suddenly we'd have all these old people to support.
That's a very good point. Because you're right. If you're looking at it just on a sort of environmental or social level, you'd think that sustainability is the kind of threshold, right? Like if it's not harmful to the earth, then it's okay to create more humans. Whereas if you look at Benatar's thing, he's like, no, you're screwing people by giving birth to them. They can't consent to being born. Yep. And therefore...
That's a crucial point.
I think it's a key distinction.
Don't consent. It's you giving someone something. So I think a nice analogy that I literally just came up with would be like, it's a bit like gifting someone $1 billion, right? Because I think the argument is that, like, in a sense, you know, say you're $100 billionaire and you're like, I get happy by making other people rich, and you're gifting money to other people, right? But you know, there's plenty of studies that show that, you know, when people receive large windfalls, it actually makes them unhappy. People who win the lottery tend to end up either equally happy or less happy when that windfall happens. So it could be something like that, whereby like you think that you're giving them so much benefit that surely it is a positive thing, even if they can't consent to it. But the argument actually is that in practice, we see that's not the case. If we can't, in this circumstance of babies, they can't rationalize it or consent to it until they're 18 plus. And if we know that on average they're actually suffering because of it, maybe we shouldn't be doing it.
It reminds me so much. We'll probably have to stick this in the show notes or something, but there's that meme you once showed me of the little cheetah cub.
Little cheetah cub looking at the mother cheetah like, why did you bring me into this world, mother? Just to bring wood into a burning house.
Look me in the eyes when I talk to you.
It's so good. Such a cute little cheetah. So I think one fundamental thing that some people will immediately pick up on, and I feel like I'm one of these people, is that when I think about the sum of my life,
mm-hmm.
I do not feel that the sum of the positive parts is not enough to counteract the negative parts. I'd say I generally enjoy my life. It's distinct though, because it's not saying like, oh, my life is terrible. To have never had the life is also to not have the worry of doing that summation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something kind of subtly different there.
He makes the point, to be fair, he's like, this isn't the same thing as saying life is not worth living. So the fact that you don't think you should bring kids into the world is not to say that life isn't worth living. Because if you happen to be alive, it faces the problem you just described of like, you're alive and then actually, you're about to come to this, I imagine, but like, why don't antinatalists just commit suicide?
Yeah. And also, could you not make a twisted argument where it's like, oh, the best thing you can do to reduce your footprint is to end your life, because then you stop consuming. Although then your body will rot and emit CO2.
Never get away from
you have to commit suicide in a freezer. But yeah, I guess the obvious follow on then is like, if you feel this way, I feel like a kind of economical opportunity cost view would be like the same argument seems to justify just ending your life. Both the antinatalist, oh, life is suffering point, and the what was the other one? And the climate change perspective, right? Like, I think the point is that obviously we want to find solutions that are not so horrible that they kind of diminish what it is to live. And a lot of people would agree that the right and pleasure of having a family is one of the greatest joys in life. That said, my parents raised me; they never say that.
That's definitely a
That's
joke.
different. Some people win the lottery, some people get me.
I think abuse is one of the, it's one of the best expressions of love.
Yeah. What? Wait, to clarify, my parents did not abuse me.
Loving abuse.
Just the emotional kind.
Anyway, moving on.
So let's think about that then.
I think there is a distinction, to be fair, for what it's worth, between to say that life is not worth living is different to saying it would have been better not to have been born in the first place. I wonder if it's kind of sunk cost, but you're basically saying like, I'm here now, and therefore you sort of strive to find meaning, as opposed to, but you can still acknowledge, I'd rather not have been here. Maybe it's like taking a bad holiday. I'd rather not have gone on holiday, but now that I'm here, I'm not going to
fly home
immediately. Terrible analogy. Maybe there's something in that. Anyway.
No, that makes sense. Like the cost of ending it immediately is painful. In the case of holiday, it's painful or scary. In the case of the holiday, it's like having to tell everyone, booking the flight, paying for it short notice. And obviously, in the life metaphor, it's not a metaphor, it's literal. It's painful ending it. Because then you put this burden on someone. Interesting. Yeah. Just a couple notes there. I think so. A lot of that. Do you think that is synonymous with saying life is meaningless? To say that life is more suffering than pleasure?
No, I don't think so. I think they're different things.
Is that how is that related to antinatalism? Genuinely asking. I didn't read up on that specific element.
How are they related?
Do antinatalists believe that life is meaningless? Is that a substantial part of it?
No, not necessarily. I don't think the conclusion of antinatalism is weird. It does sound quite nihilistic, right? It sounds like nihilistic. But I feel like it's the reason antinatalists aren't like all sort of forming suicide pacts is that maybe it's a little bit like the absurdists, right? There's meaning to be had in the suffering, but you sort of have this view that it would be better not to have suffered at all.
Yeah. Well, no, I feel like the absurdists, absurdism would take the point that like you can form your own meaning. And so it's definitely a good thing to bring people into life. And it would be more their fault. I'm not an expert in this, we're armchair philosophers.
Yeah.
I feel like their stance may be that it would be more your fault for not realizing or accepting the absurdity of life and finding your own meaning.
That's
Or finding meaning in that absurdity.
Yeah, that's definitely the kind of Camus style thing, right? So just Camus, famous philosopher, existentialist, absurdist, as you say.
So it's not the god's fault for punishing Sisyphus. It's Sisyphus's fault for not finding meaning in what life he has.
Which is that sort of famous ending line of The Myth of Sisyphus. So it's a book by Camus, for anyone who doesn't know, who he talks about the Greek myth, the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is the guy who was condemned to roll a rock up a hill. And every time he got to the top, the rock would be, was it made to roll down? The rock rolls back down to the bottom. He has to go back down the hill and roll it back up again. And
that's it.
Yeah, it's just a metaphor for the absurdity of life, because I think a lot of religions in particular, and a lot of people want to believe that life has a kind of inherent purpose to it. There's the sense that like you have a purpose that you're destined to fulfill. And actually I think the sort of the underpinning struggle behind existentialism and the claim that Camus makes is that actually such inherent meaning doesn't exist. It's not given to you. You kind of have to go and strive for your own, and that's absurd.
There's no objective meaning.
Yes,
but you can inject life with your own meaning.
And he has this kind of wry line at the end of Sisyphus where he's like, he describes the moment where Sisyphus got to the top and then the rock rolls back down and Sisyphus like turns and looks at the sunset or something, or looks at the rock rolling down. He's like, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. He has like a wry smile in his face or something. It's just like, you kind of embrace the ridiculousness.
Yeah. And it's your absurdism. Mm-hmm. But so then saying, do antinatalists think that there's no meaning to life? It feels like it has to be the logical conclusion, because the logical conclusion of like the extreme antinatalists, not just the climate change antinatalists, is that no one would exist anymore, right?
I agree. And I mean, meaning and pleasure, pain are different things, I guess. They're different dimensions to life. Yeah. But I feel like you could live a life of suffering, fill it with meaning, and therefore still deem it worth living. Do you know what I mean? Like,
I remember I had a very strange feeling. I was reading.
This is after the curry last night.
Yes, no, right in the bottom of my stomach. Or I remember there was a, I can't remember, there was a joke. I can't remember how the joke even goes, but that just reminded me. There was someone said at a restaurant. I think my dad said as a joke at a restaurant, and just it fell flat and no one liked it. I was like, "How do you feel about your wife?" And he says, "I love her from the bottom of my heart and the heart of my bottom." What does that even mean? Anyway,
it was just a terrible translation.
I don't know. But I'm sure that he'll listen to this and remind me what the actual story is, but just that specific part. Anyway, we're talking about meaning. I was reading another name. For those who haven't listened to every episode yet, I'm a fan of Vonnegut, and also I didn't grow up in America, so I wasn't told to like him in high school.
My own opinion.
Yeah, I formed my own opinion. Like, it's actually he's very much unknown. I'd say, despite being a cult, favorite. Like, he's very much unknown in the UK. I'd say.
Yeah, relatively more so.
Well, I mean, like in the way that, like, if you say, Of Mice and Men or something, it's like, yeah, well, who didn't read that at high school? Whereas here, like, it is very much like the average person in the UK doesn't know who he is.
Cool. You've justified your taste in Vonnegut.
I'm justified. I am not the reading equivalent of a basic bitch.
Sure.
Anyway, Siren's a Titan. Long story short, don't worry about the how or why, but a family ends up on a distant moon, and it's the mother, the father, and the son. And it's funny because it did give me this distinct sense of, in that context, like what is the point of the child, right? It really did feel that kind of, it kind of put into perspective of like it diminished the argument that we're talking about down to the logical extreme, which is the last people. And there was this kind of profound sense of what is the point? He found ways to fill his life. He seemed happy, etc. He's a made up character, but but it did give me a profound sense of geez, there was just something so pointless about it when they existed by themselves, and there was no possible way for him to be rescued or have children of his own or anything. It really did bring the absurdity of his life, because it was an absurd situation, into sharp contrast.
I'm glad you brought that up, because actually I haven't read that and I didn't realize that was the case, but I did have a note to bring up that thought experiment, exactly that. Yeah. Would you have kids in that situation? What would you do?
I just kind of feel like, yeah, so you and your partner are trapped on a moon, right?
Yeah.
Or like far off somewhere by yourself. I feel like, what's the point?
It does then at that point bring home that argument of condemning someone to fate that's... are we looking at that just purely through the lens of like, you can live a fulfilling life with people around you, and humans have that need for social interaction, if that's anything the last year has taught us?
I mean, you could flip it around and you could have the kind of Adam and Eve argument. Kind of gross, but like, you know, if your job is repopulating. I mean, if it was like Adam and Eve and Maria and Charlotte, and, you know, but my point there being that like you didn't need to commit like direct incest, then maybe it'd be an awkward family dynamic, right? Also, what happens if it's like you keep going and you just keep having like one gender?
Tricky.
But sorry, derailing it. My takeaway is actually, if I was in that situation, right? Like, let's say I was on the moon, right? I knew that it wasn't an Adam and Eve situation. Like, we will fairly soon perish. Like, we don't have the resources or whatever. It would feel kind of pointless having a child. Does that then support not having children because of climate change? No, because I don't think climate change will end the planet. I think that we'll be able to stop it.
That, I think, is the key. No, well, I think that's the key element to it, is like, so one thing worth mentioning is antinatalism is not like a new thing. This isn't a movement that's just sprung up because people are concerned about climate change. The exact same thing happened over the Cold War. People were like, oh my God, we're going to enter a nuclear holocaust. Is it wrong to bring children into this world of nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare? And I don't know, it presumably had roots before that. There have been crises before, but that was certainly...
Schopenhauer was a proponent, and he's way before the Cold War, right?
Yeah, he's old.
He's old.
But that was certainly a famous recent example of when this movement actually got some traction. There were people who made significant life decisions based around that information. So what was my point there? Why am I telling you this, Ant?
Honestly, Jake, I wonder about most of the things that you tell me.
What did you just ask me? It was relevant. It was definitely relevant.
Wasn't that interesting, to be honest?
Oh, we're talking about climate change. So we're saying...
Are we? Is that what today's episode is about?
No, it's all come back to me now. We were saying that how stringently you apply the antinatalist argument in the current context depends a little bit on how 100%. Fatalistic you are about climate change. Is climate change the end of the world? And I'm saying people thought that in the past, and thankfully they were wrong, because my God, imagine if everyone stopped having babies in the Cold War, then Manos and Pepe wouldn't have got together, and that was probably after the Cold War.
Yeah, probably quite a while. To be fair, 1994, the year I was born, also the year the Berlin Wall fell down. So actually they got together before it ended, technically.
1989, mate.
Huh?
Done in 1989.
Is that true?
Yeah.
I thought I was born the same year as... Wait.
You've been living a lie, I'm sorry.
Fuck yeah.
This episode is brought to you by Klaviyo, the platform that powers smarter digital relationships. With Klaviyo, you can activate all your customer data in real time, connect seamlessly with your customers across all channels, guide your marketing strategy with AI-powered insights, recommendations, and automated assistance, deliver experiences that feel individually designed at scale, and grow your business faster. Power smarter digital relationships with Klaviyo. Learn more at klaviyo.com/Spotify. That's KLAVIYO.com/Spotify.
What the hell? Oh, you know what? It's when it was finished, when they finished demolishing it.
It says the same thing, is it?
No. It says weirdly, it says demolished 9th November 1989 to 1994.
Okay. All right.
How the hell did I get that fact so wrong? So they finished demolishing the Berlin Wall the same year I was born.
Yeah, fair.
Anyway,
so yeah, it's a good thing that people didn't stop having kids in the Cold War, and I think you could probably make the same case quite strongly here.
Okay.
But I think that's probably a good time to wrap up antinatalism. We've done the thought experiment, but just quickly on this point, do you buy, like, let's say the world was totally doomed. Do you buy the argument that then...
I don't even think we need to be that extreme. You know what? Thinking about it a bit, the argument that you need to be considerate of the suffering that you may impart on your child, I think is relevant. But I think, for example, I don't think that life is suffering. I don't think the world is doomed. So I don't follow the antinatalism general or via climate change arguments. But I do think that, for example, are you doing something wrong by having children beyond your means? Probably. But I want to be careful, because that's a slippery slope to then turning the right to have children into some sort of elitist, aristocratic right. I want to be careful. Like, we really need to balance, on the one hand, making sure that right is reasonably accessible to everyone. But on the other hand, like, should 16-year-olds who are heroin addicts be able to have 10 children? I mean, I'm making it sound like they should be neutered. I'm not saying that, but like, do I think that they might be doing something inconsiderate or wrong by having children?
Yes.
I think I think that they are not being considerate of the suffering that child might face because of their inability to adequately raise it.
Yeah. I don't think that's a horribly controversial point of view.
Yeah. So basically, if you're in a position, it could be financially, it could be, maybe you are just not in a position. I can't think of another example other than emotionally. Yeah. I mean, maybe you have a history of serious mental illness.
You don't have the support networks around.
Maybe you have a serious genetic disease.
Oh, yeah,
those are all good examples of maybe you are not properly considering the suffering that the child might have to bear, and whether that child will be able to fairly live a life, or conversely, whether you will be pushing the responsibility to help that child have a reasonable life onto other people.
That's a fine example. That's like the HIV example, isn't it? That's really true.
Oh, well, as in, like, should you be able to have now it's not a thing, but yes, when it was a thing.
When it was a thing, yeah. Okay, fair. All right, so...
Wait, do you have an opinion, or do you just agree?
No, I agree with you. That was easy.
Oh, wow.
Up next. So we said there were two arguments. Let's just zoom out a second. We said there were two arguments for why it would be wrong to have kids in the era of climate change. And we've talked about it being wrong in terms of causing suffering to your children. The second argument was that having kids actually contributes to the problem of climate change. So is having kids harmful for the planet? And is that therefore a justification for not having children?
I have a high level answer, and I just don't think I'm going to change it much through discussion.
Sure.
And this is kind of my answer to most climate change things. And it kind of forms, I think it's fair to say, our philosophy running a startup that fights climate change. We need to take radical action. That's true, right? But I think that there's kind of two things. One, you're not going to convince people to take... You need to think practically about the radical actions you will be able to convince people to take. And two, we need to actually balance, like, the point of fighting climate change is to preserve, reasonable lives, right?
To create a better world.
To create a better world. If the way to do that is to enforce things that are, going to make life significantly worse, then that actually doesn't quite stack up. And I get that some of that is like, maybe the argument is people are underestimating the cost in the long term, which means that they are not accepting the necessary pains in the short term, and actually in the long term calculus won't add up. But I also think some of those arguments don't consider increasing interest over the coming years, increasing technology, particularly in terms of like carbon capture.
Yes.
Within kind of a small single digit number of decades, carbon capture should be a totally like affordable, reasonable technology. It still remains a little bit out of reach. We have counterfactual offsetting, like the stuff we do, getting people onto renewable energies rather than fossil fuels. And we also have, technologies that are going to help it's carbon capture in a sense, but it's not direct carbon capture to stop carbon release in like industrial settings and things like that. Yeah, my overarching point is, what's the point if it's more painful than the thing we're trying to stop? And, we have to think about practical arguments that will actually get people to be on board with, right?
Those are two quite distinct things. The second one is kind of the angry vegans in the 70s argument, right?
Yeah. Which, for those who don't know, there's just a great outtake from Cowspiracy, where I think, I can't remember what his context was, but someone was basically talking about veganism in the 70s, and he was saying the biggest mistake that they make, and I still feel this today, the biggest mistake that the vegan movement makes is presenting an absolutist perspective, right?
And becoming quite an exclusive force.
Yes, exactly. Because on the one hand, you know what? Like, you're probably right. But being practical, it is a better policy to encourage everyone to reduce their meat a bit, and and some people to go fully vegan if they're happy. Basically, it's better to think like, what policy impact can I actually affect, rather than use marketing strategies that guilt people. Eating any meat is murder, etc., etc. And basically, the net result is that yes, you get some people to 100% change their diet, but the number of people you're going to get to do that is going to be low single digits. And on top of that, you're actually probably going to alienate a lot of other people.
Yeah, which is key, right?
Yeah. And also the other thing is convenience. Like, you need to think about how do we make what's easier, right? Giving people incentives to, for example, counteract having children, like the negative effects of having extra children, or trying to enforce a ban on people doing one of the most natural things that comes to human beings, right?
During the way you said natural, I don't know why.
Oh, natural. made it sound sexual, right? I mean, like, just think about the Chinese one-child policy, right? It's just not really enforceable. And like, also think about it if you're born the second child, like, that's not the child's fault. Like, what happens to that child? And then all sorts of weird externalities happen as well, where like suddenly like the gender split was totally messed
It's really
up.
bad for girls, yeah. Well,
And it's bad for gender equality. Like, anyway, so that was my high level, and I don't think it's going to change. Go on, you.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I was going to say, I mean, the reason this gets talked about is there were some studies done, I forget when, but in the last decade. And the original studies produced some pretty stark and alarming data that having kids could be the single biggest cause of emissions in your life. And I mean, like, I've seen graphs, and it's like you can driving a car, like eating meat, all this stuff, and it's like all ticking along, and then suddenly it's like having a child, and it's like boom, and it's like massively,
right?
Yeah, that's the argument. And effectively, but I mean, there's some scientific criticism against that, right? And you've kind of pointed to that fact. The main criticism is they've basically kind of accounted for emissions at this point in time, assumed they'll stay constant, and then like basically spread that over a child's entire predicted life.
Yeah.
Which I think even the car and sort of stuff doesn't get that treatment. Technology is going to evolve is the point. So like, if you have a child in a completely green society where all the energy is green, their footprint is negligible. It's the same reason like kids in developing countries.
They could even in a convoluted way contribute to the GDP of a country that's investing in fighting it and has like a surplus of carbon capture in decades to come. Because I know to be literal about what you're saying now, the UK is reducing its non-green energy share every year, right? So it's not fair to extrapolate on the basis of it being straight or linear. I know that, for example, Mike Berners-Lee talks about like, if everyone reaches American levels of consumption, but I don't know that is the necessary end game that everyone will continue to consume.
I don't think that's the trajectory. And America is actually quite unique. I mean, America and China both, a lot of countries in the world either have smaller populations or just different energy mixes.
Just remind me of something else as well. Okay. And this is a kind of weird indirect argument. Geopolitical factors, right? So I listened to a great podcast. I think it was Matt Iglesias on Rationally Speaking, on the argument for 1 billion Americans, right? Not Americans don't care about American geopolitical supremacy, but one thing to consider is, okay, the countries who overwhelmingly care about this are developed Western nations, and geopolitically they are becoming less and less important over time. Partially, like a large part of the reason that China is going to be more powerful than the US is just pure numbers of people, right?
Sure.
Maybe the situation in China and India and stuff will change over time. So maybe it's unfair. Maybe it's more a factor of development, of being, a full developed country, that your perspective on these factors changes. But when you look at like the authoritarian position that China has at the moment, and their kind of position as by far the largest emitter in the world, and also probably the most, I want to say, most greenwashy loose. Is that fair to say? I don't know if that's, oh God, please don't chase me down, Chinese government. But my point is, could you see a geopolitical argument where we need to be bolstering
for the UK or
the Western democratic societies? I mean, to clarify for anyone who didn't get from that, I'm an international relations realist, and I'm a little bit concerned about the relative rise of authoritarian powers that literally have concentration camps and are the biggest emitters by far. Those are two facts. The Uyghurs in China are in concentration camps, and China is by far the largest emissions creator. Could there be an argument that actually the fact that we're having this conversation primarily in the West is actually just going to further destabilize that geopolitical position and lead to worse outcomes?
I see. You're taking a totally, you're taking a totally different sort of view of the consequences. And you're saying like, actually, there's a completely different negative outcome.
Or that maybe we're not going to be able to impact it if we become too relatively weak and they just decide to keep doing it.
Let me make one other sort of criticism of the argument then, which is you've kind of got from this already, but children are more than just emitters of carbon, right?
Right. They also emit poop.
They do that too, but they also emit joy and meaning and hope. That was a bit cutesy.
For those who don't know, Jake's secretly cutesy.
Take my point that Stop it. Stop interrupting me. The point is, when you're bringing a child into the world, you're not just bringing in like a new source of emissions. You're also bringing in something that will motivate you to keep pushing for the changes the world desperately needs. In fact,
a potential future climate scientist.
And I think actually what drives a lot of people to care about climate change, especially older generations, they're not too worried about being around to see the effects, but they do worry for the sake of their kids and their grandkids. And they're like, actually, this is a reason to give a crap about climate change, is because there is that sort of future outcome.
So the greatest cause is also the greatest motivator.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So there you go.
I can buy that. I think the fundamental point that I stand by, though, is that the point of fighting climate change is to preserve a good life. And if sacrificing the things that make a good life is how to achieve that, then my compromise is that we should probably have reasonable policies that, for example, you should have to make a supernormal tax contribution that goes directly to some sort of climate fighting situation, or, again, that we want to be careful because that becomes like an elitist aristocracy. But maybe the government,
maybe cap and trade things, permits for children.
Maybe the government has to be funding that, like, because the government has the incentive to increase population to and grow GDP and improve their geopolitical stature. Maybe the government should be funding that for every additional child that people have.
When you say additional child, are you imagining like a sort of putting a number on it, like a 2-child policy, for example?
Yeah, I mean, a situation where, I don't know the specific number, but like a situation where people have like some number of children that they can have without issue.
A 2-child policy has a certain logical appeal to it, right? Because that would be the number that just sustains a population. And you also presume
actually, I think the replacement rate's like just over 2.
It would be because, to be fair, death and people who don't have kids, if you had a 2-child policy, you'd actually see relative population decline.
Yeah, I think it's like 2.1 is the actual.
Again, on aggregate, that would be kind of beneficial, not just from climate change point of view, but like food and other resources.
Yeah.
It's obviously also not what's happening. The world is tending towards overpopulation, and so therefore it would be a step to reduce that.
Yeah. So again, maybe we're biased because of our position and the kind of research we've done it, but I feel like it's legitimate to be worried about it. I don't think you have a duty to not have children. I think you probably do have a duty to, for example, try and reduce your footprint. Well, you have that duty anyway. It doesn't matter whether you have a child or not. But you have that duty is even more stark if you are increasing your emissions in some way. And you also have a duty, I would say, and I would not be surprised if within decades it's actually like a kind of tax people have to pay, like the same way that you do on cars that are more emitting. I think that you could consider, for example, taking direct positive action to counteract that impact if you are particularly worried. In fact, not even if you're particularly worried. If you're not particularly worried, you should be.
Yeah. I mean, from my point of view, I don't really buy either argument. I think in the first case, I'm too much of an optimist to subscribe to antinatalism. I think
life is good.
It's melodramatic to say that life is riddled with suffering and therefore you shouldn't bring kids into it. And I think as well, 2 reasons. I mean, one, I think enough is being worked on with climate change and you need kids to have the potential to continue to fight it. Thus, like, it's not a total doomsday. Like, I don't think you're condemning kids to an inevitably terrible fate by having them in this day and age, in spite of, like, obviously climate change still, there's a lot of work to do. But also, I think it's the reason we just discussed. I think if you don't have kids, the logical extension of that is that you either sort of climate change wins by destroying the world, or it doesn't need to win because you destroy the world by removing humans from it. But I think there's reasons to be skeptical on both points. However,
it kind of feels like in order to stop our enemy killing us, we will kill ourselves.
That's rather. I think my takeaway would be, if we're going to be sort of practical about it, if you're in the kind of position where you are, obviously we haven't really talked about adoption, but there's lots of kids who don't have there's lots of kids who grow up without like sort of happy family environments who need homes. And I guess if you're in the kind of position where you choose to adopt rather than have kids, that's an extremely noble thing to do, especially if climate change is your sort of motive there.
Also for eliminating suffering in the world.
Massively so. So huge respect to anyone who makes that decision. I think I can see an argument for having a sort of kids policy, exactly like you discussed, in terms of like limiting overpopulation. But I think you're right that it needs global.
Yeah. There was also a thing where they discussed, I think in the UK, a policy where like the tax on flights becomes incrementally more expensive. Maybe that's the way you do it with children. It just becomes incrementally more expensive to have children. And you know what? Is having 10 kids like something that is ruled out specifically to the aristocratic elite? I think I can live with that. Like, I don't think the right to have 10 children, in a developed country is so fundamental that like we're doing a great disservice to other people by saying like, you can't afford it, you can't have 10 kids. Although I guess the difficulty with children is what happens if people have them anyway.
Yeah.
God. Well, what a place to end it, because we're running out of time on our trial. Jake, anything to add today?
We are. No, I think that's a great place to end. Yeah, good to be back, everybody.
Good to be back.
Final bits of housekeeping is
please leave a review.
Yes. Do leave us, leave us a review. We have a newsletter. Please subscribe to that if you want to stay up to date with updates and memes and other stuff that we'll send you.
But the review is more important. Yeah. Seriously, it actually helps us. People like actually think we're a big deal when you do it. They're like, whoa, people actually review these guys. Wow, lots of reviews. But no, if you actually enjoy it, if you don't think we're total shit, then do it, please. It would be very helpful. Also, check out Alted Clothing. It's pretty good.
Yeah. Check out Stasher, check out Tree Points. Tree Points, especially if you're interested in climate change.
Oh, yeah, I should have said.
Check out the blog. There's a ton of really interesting content on there. We're not pushing you to go subscribe or anything, but look out for us. We're working with many more businesses now. You'll see Tree Points pop up at the checkout as an option to either plant trees, offset carbon, or recycle plastic. More things to come there. I think that's it. Yeah. Stay tuned. Subscribe if you like it, and we'll hopefully it won't be too long before we do another episode. Any ideas what we might do next time, or no promises at this point?
Bye.
No promises at this point then. See you later, everybody. Bye.
Someone out there knows who did it.
There's people out there just keeping quiet, not telling us what they know.
My expectation would be
somebody out there knows something.
That somebody would know about it other than just the killer.
I firmly believe
someone out there knows who did it.
Somebody would know about it.
Somebody knows who did
it. Somebody out there knows something.
Who is the Cheesewire Killer? Listen to the full series now, wherever you get your podcasts.